I'm Angus Jenkinson. Most of you probably know that by now. Today we have another session, and I'm just going to use the fact that it's now reached 6 o'clock to begin a leisurely introduction to the session, after which I'm going to be handing over to Tom, as I will explain. I can imagine that some of the people on this in this meeting really know a great deal about PCT or perceptual control theory. Maybe you studied it before I was born, for all I know. Although that would be difficult because I'm kind of gray-haired as well. But anyway, you may know it for quite a long time, since it arguably dates back to the 50s. We may hear more about that. But on the other hand, for some of you, this, even if you are quite deeply steeped in cybernetics, this may be a relatively novel territory, in part because PCT isn't always billed as cybernetics. It doesn't have the label, it is cybernetics as such. But historically, there have been very close ties between cybernetics and PCT. And I believe a huge affinity between these two related fields, so that they belong at any rate to a general family related. And there are many key aspects that within PCT that are deeply important, I believe, to cyberneticians. So I have unashamedly set up this session to try and get more encouragement amongst the cybernetic community to get into understanding PCT and vice versa. And I think it's got important contributions to make. I think cybernetics is still an evolving science, and it's got evolving arts and disciplines and practices. And I think the same is true of PCT. And sometimes this cross-fertilization helps, and we may be able to help each other in that process. What I've done for this particular session is invited two people to introduce it to us. So this is not a session aimed at the aficionados of PCT, but it is an opportunity to get into really understanding the fundamentals of PCT, something of its history, what it's actually taught the world, and why it matters so much from a point of view of understanding. The leading individual that I've invited to guide us through a lot of that is Warren Mansell. He's a reader in clinical psychology, I believe, at Manchester University, and a very engaging personality in this field. The other is Tom Scholte. Many of you will have met him a month ago. Cyberneticians and scientists sometimes look like artists, and Tom is one of them. And sometimes they look like designers. And I think, at least in some of the research work that Warren has done, Warren looks sometimes like that. But scientists should always, I think, however passionate they are, be human. And these two are thoroughly human personalities. And it's a great pleasure to invite them, to welcome them, and to welcome all of you. So I'm going to hand over with that to Tom and ask you to take it away, Tom.
Thank you very much, Angus. It's so great to be back here with all of you. I had such a wonderful time. I can't believe it's been a month. Like that just is, I can't wrap my brain around that. And those of you who are meeting for the first time, thanks for joining. I'm speaking to you from Vancouver, Canada, which also happens to be on the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territories of the Musqueam people. I'm sort of along to be Warren's, not a foil exactly, because Warren and I are actually, I would say we're playing on the same team. But as a person who identifies as a cybernetician and who had spent a few years sort of really going deep down the rabbit hole of cybernetics before I stumbled upon a very small piece by Bill Powers in Heinz von Förster's famous compendium, Cybernetics of Cybernetics, that he produced with his graduate students around 1975 at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And there was this one little piece called Beyond Behaviorism, where there's this exchange between Bill Powers and someone, and it really caught my attention. the more I poked around, those of you here a month ago will know that my work has been around theater, and my gateway was these overlaps between the Stanislavski system of acting and its purpose, goal-driven, purposive behavior focus, and cybernetics. I very quickly began to discover that PCT had gone even further in a way that was providing even more finer grained analysis, and was even of greater utility for me in my research than any of the other things I'd found in cybernetics thus far. So I got really excited about this and about research, and began casting about for who out there is a university-based researcher who might actually take the time to talk to me. And in that, I quickly found Warren Mansell, who was very hospitable, and I ended up spending a part of my sabbatical over in Manchester working with Warren, learning more about PCT and MOL. So as we used to say during the Quebec referendum of 1995, there were people who had t-shirts that said, "My Canada includes Quebec." I would have a t-shirt that says, "My cybernetics includes PCT." But that's just me personally. There's a lot of different story, it's a contested history, which is certainly interesting. But I think what Warren and I were hoping we could talk about is just to make sure that some ideas about PCT are clear before the group, rather than go into the weeds about the historical overlaps and internecine struggles, because you'll get a different story from every person, all of which are partially true and in some ways absolutely wrong. And like all stories, that we can only have a partial view. So I think as good constructivists, those of us who think of ourselves that way, will embrace the multitude of viewpoints on origin stories, etc., and hopefully take a real pragmatic approach to, is there something in what we're going to talk about that's of use to you in your work? So I will turn it over to, I will just introduce Warren Mansell, reader in clinical psychology at University of Manchester. And I'll start him off with a question. So we know he's a psychologist and teaches psychology. Warren, what brought you to PCT as a psychologist?
Okay, first, thanks Angus for organising this. Thanks Tom for the question. I did my research and my early clinical work in a therapy called cognitive behaviour therapy. And it's a sort of an uneasy combination of cognitive theory and behavioural theory, which I had kind of got myself well versed with, to the point that I realised they didn't really connect together that well. There was an arena of beliefs and thoughts, and then there was an arena of associative learning and conditioning. And even though these two areas work together and still do, I could not see a theoretical overlap between the two of them. So I went on a hunt for some theory that would properly integrate the higher level processes with the lower level processes. And I came across a chapter by Gary Zico in a book called Without Miracles, which is on universal selectionism, Donald Campbell's kind of approach. And there was a chapter in there where it explained PCT. And there was just a neat diagram from one of Bill's books where it showed the hierarchy of control, with the control over the lower level experiences, perceptions, going right up to the more increasingly abstract level perceptions as you get to the top. And I saw that hierarchy and I thought, right, at least somebody's trying to build a working model of how cognition and behavior and the world link together. Because up until that point, I'd only seen heuristic boxes and arrows and not proper working diagrams. And so I got Behaviour, the Control Perception, which is the key reference for PCT, written in 1972 by Bill Powers. He's working on it for about 10 years, almost in a solitary process. Read that book and then decided at that point I needed to engage as widely as possible with this approach. And I wrote a paper to try and explain psychological distress using PCT, bringing in Bill's work. It took about 5 years to get published. And when it did in 2005, Tim Carey contacted me and said, you know that theory that you've kind of written this paper on, I've been using it for the last decade to inform method of levels therapy, and I'm using it in a Scottish mental health service, come up and see it. And so I went to see Tim, and having seen method of levels in action, at that point, I decided, right, all my future research is going to go in that direction, and took a group of colleagues with me on that journey through research, particularly Sarah Tai, who ever since that point we've worked together on PCT work. We're both clinical psychologists, but we've both got a real wide spectrum of interests.
Great. Can you just say, just briefly before we jump into some of the heart of PCT, when you say you were having trouble reconciling the cognition stuff with the behavior stuff, can you say a little bit about the difference between those two terms, talking about the cognitive versus the behavioral, and this uneasy, what you saw as an uneasy sort of relationship between the two? So the cognitive versus the behavioral.
Well, there's a notorious disjunct between higher level processes like beliefs and even intentions, and then behavior, and how you kind of draw that thought behavior gap. And very few theories even try and explain it. And a lot of time you talk to a cognitive therapist about it, and they say, well, you know, we use a therapy that helps people to reappraise their experiences. But if you want to learn, if you want to know how the person learnt those experiences in the first place, look at behavioral theory. It's probably to do with conditioning, you know. So there's this kind of sort of strange way that they kind of share the burden of explanation without integrating them into one framework.
Great, thank you. It reminds me of my first encounter with this beyond behaviorism thing, where there was just an interesting discussion about something I'd thought about previously, this idea that yes, you can ring the bell and make the dog salivate, but if the dog's not interested in food in the first place, then you're probably not going to get very far. So maybe there's something to do with what the dog wanted in the first place, which then you choose to control. It needs to be thought about.
So basically, that's the key.
Yeah,
the key to realize that it's all about controlling.
Right. Okay. And so we'll launch in with the provocative phrase at the center of all this, which is behavior is the control of perception. So can you unpack that phrase for us a little bit?
Well, should we unpack it with a video that
Sure.
you're very familiar with and you use, or a demonstration that you use, one that Bill developed. It's been used widely in the PCT community. It might have been used more broadly. But if people will humour me for a moment, I'm just going to play a video. On this video, all you can see is two people's hands, okay? They've both got a pen, each has got a pen in their hand, and when they move the pen, it's going to leave the trace of the pen as a record of their behaviour over time, okay? One of the people's on the left, one is on the right. The one on the right is me, I'm like the experimenter. And I've given an instruction to the person on the left, okay? I've told them what to do. And all you need to do is watch this video and have a think about what that person on the left was told to do, okay? So I'm going to share screen now, and hopefully this will run smoothly. Can everyone see a frozen video at the moment? Okay, so watch this carefully. Okay, so I only want answers from people who have not seen this before, okay? So either write it down in the chat. Actually, we could probably just do a load of answers in the chat. Is probably the most efficient way of doing this, to see what kind of range of answers we get. And it may be that because this is a cybernetics audience, everyone's going to get it right on the money.
Are they mirroring the experiments, says Steve?
Okay, so that's a classic answer to this.
Are they mirroring the experimenter? Keep the center of the knot over the dot, says Daniel.
Okay, so Daniel has got the answer, okay?
I've seen it before, says Ed, so of course he's kind enough as not to say.
Yeah, so this is great that people...
Clement agreed with Daniel.
yeah.
Or
Once
Clement?
once you've seen the answer, you will definitely agree with Daniel. Let's watch it one more time and see if this is about keeping the knot.
I'll tell you what, Warren, when I did it with a group, they took 45 minutes. This is 10 bright people, took 45 minutes trying to work out what was going on with so many different theories. So that somebody jumps to it just shows we have some geniuses in this group.
Right. Yeah, it's about perspective though, rather than intelligence. But if you've got the right
Just
perspective
kidding.
on life, you'll get this right. Okay, you seeing it again?
No, what we're actually seeing, I think, is some emails from you and a small image. The image is there, but it's gone small.
Okay, let me
It's not-
try
I
that.
think we got your whole desktop there.
That's fine. Let me try and find it here again. Okay, so I'll rewind this again. So watch it now again, and watch the knot of the rubber bands, and watch the dot on the piece of paper. Can you see that the knot is kept very close to the dot? Okay. So Daniel was absolutely.
But Daniel may be only half right, because his answer was only, I would say, half definitive.
Well, let's wind it back a bit, okay? So like you were saying, when you did this, it took about 45 minutes for people to get it. We've done we've done 4 studies on this, and about 90% of people don't notice that it's about keeping the knot over the dot. A very common answer is that it's to mirror the experimenter, to copy the experimenter, to do the opposite.
Do the opposite.
Yeah. Doing. And then there's a whole other raft of answers around to draw a picture, like to draw 2 kangaroos boxing.
Yes.
Or to sometimes to go against what the experimenter's doing, etc.
Yeah. What always strikes me about this, Warren, I just want to put in is that the list of other explanations are often really, really great explanations of the behavior from a certain angle, because yes, they are doing the opposite. One I often get is keep a certain amount of tension in the elastic. Those are all actually accurate as descriptions of what is seen, but none of them for the reason behind it, which to me is
what the person on the left actually thought they were doing and actually were doing from their perspective.
Yes.
So, and the most elegant, very elegant way there from Richard to keep one's perception of the knot's position in line with one's perception of the dot's position. Rick Markins here in the audience, he did a really elegant computer model, both to show that the control of perception was what was accounting for this pattern. But he also found there was a slight skew on it, because the volunteer was sitting to the side of the dot, so there was a bit of parallax error there. So the perception of where the knot and the dot is very much from the perception of that actor who's controlling their input. This in the simplest way is what PCT is all about. And
Warren, can I just check with you one thing, please? Were you trying to keep the knot over the dot?
Me, I was just on the right. I was just doing random stuff.
Right. So actually, it's important to recognize that one of you was not trying to keep the knot over the dot.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Well, I was being a disturbance to what I'd instructed the volunteer to do. So I knew I was doing a PCT experiment.
Right.
So I knew that I needed to create some challenges to the ability of the volunteer to keep the knot over the dot.
So what does it mean? What was your partner doing if you were being disruptive or perturbing the situation? What was he or she doing?
They were keeping the knot over the dot as they perceived it.
And what did that amount to?
Exactly what you saw. And you saw that trace. You see all kinds of side effects of them trying to keep their perception of the knot over their perception of the dot. You see them pulling against the other person. You see them drawing a picture they didn't even intend to draw. You see, you can often, if the experimenter pulls suddenly, you see what looks like a stimulus response connection, because a sudden onset of a disturbance creates a lag to a sudden attempt to try and counteract that disturbance, which looks like there's a stimulus response connection. And so you can use this rubber band to show how stimulus response psychology, we would argue, is an artifact of the time frame over which you change aspects of the environment around the individual. And because we're so used to this history of tachistoscopes in the mid-20th century, where we had to present sudden onset stimuli, we think that's how you do experiments. But actually, that's not how life is about. Life is about navigating yourself through your own perceptions of the world. And that's why I'm really excited by things like virtual reality research, which is really untapped. And actually, if a change happens slowly to you, you control for it so effortlessly and so dynamic, you don't even notice that control is happening. So it illustrates amazing things. I also use it clinically to say, we all have knots over dots. We have knots over dots for anything that matters to us.
So there's a question here. When did it move or change from correction to prediction at any point in the experiment?
I don't follow the question, Angus.
Exactly. I think that's right. It's never did. It was never about that.
No necessity for prediction in this model of controlling a knot over the dots. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So behavior then, according to Bill's theory, is the control of perception. And so the behavior is not what we control. The behavior is everything that happens as we attempt to make the knots line up over the dots, and that those are organized in a hierarchy. So can you take us then into the idea of the levels, if that feels like the next?
Well, let me just actually, let's have a look at, I might end up showing you my, oh no, here we go. Okay, so you should be in my PowerPoints now. Can you see our closed loop?
Yep.
So this is one of the most recent diagrams that Bill Powers drew of the way that control works within PCT. And you've got to think of this loop as a building block, okay? Now, I guess if I was going to go through this in absolute detail, it might take too long. But the important thing well, there's several important things, but what we need to kind of be clear about is that the control is happening inside the organism as it compares a perceptual signal, so which is a function of what's outside in the environment, to a reference point for that signal. Okay, so in the example of the knot and the dot, the idea is you've got some analog signal in your brain which represents the distance of the knot over the dot as you perceive it, and as that distance gets larger, the comparator creates a larger output in an ongoing way. Okay, and that's called the error signal. That error signal is transformed in various ways. It's typically amplified. That drives aspects of your body and the world, which together we call the feedback function, which counteract things in the environment. In this case, that was me pulling the rubber band in the other way to keep the aspects of the environment in a constrained or at a target level. And this is happening constantly and dynamically as the loop is going round, okay? So that person is controlling their perception of where the knot is relative to their perception of where the dot is. And they're doing that because they have these functions that allow that information or that signal to be constructed from their environment, compared against their goal, their reference point, and dynamically adjusted. There's no stimulus process response here. There's no stage-like process. This cycle is happening continuously in an ongoing way, such that the agent, the thing controlling, is controlling its input, if that makes sense. And the elegant thing about Bill's work is he specified exactly what each of these components did, which it then in turn allows the mathematics of those to be constructed. It allows computational models, robots to be constructed to test the theory. So it's a theory that's both deeply philosophical, but also specified to such a level that you can build machines and simulations to test the theory, which, you know, was exactly what I was looking for. And I think we should all be looking for within the realms of psychology, neuroscience, and cybernetics.
And of
While
course,
you're there, there's a question from the audience, from Paul Pangaro, who's the president of the ASC, and it might be a good time to take it just before you leave. Is there a reason not to use the terminology sensor and effector? Is
No
there
reason at
an
all.
important difference?
No, I mean, the terminology, the words of PCT were obviously chosen very carefully by Bill Powers, but ultimately it's the function, it's the operationalization of these components of the theory that matter. You know, and I have to come up against this so much within clinical psychology, because people intertwine the things they call goals, principles, rules, ideals, standards, and they reify these words like values. They reify them as though they're an actual thing. These are just words that we humble human beings try and apply to the workings of this neural system. So do not get hung up on the way on the choice of words.
I asked the question only.
The operational criteria of the components that you're interested in.
I asked the question in the spirit of looking for commonalities between existing terminology.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about that. There's
I'm not worried.
Commonality, yeah.
Okay, so there are lots of questions are starting to pile up in the chat. We will make sure there's a lot of time for questions. I want to make sure we get the explication of the further structure of the theory, though. So can we move into then the levels?
Yeah. Let's do that. Okay, so this is a fabulous illustration that was put together by Fred Nichols, a member of the...
I think I might have shared this last time too. This might be one that this is certainly one I use with my acting students.
Right. I mean, there's a few things to point to here. One is that the two-way connections between the levels. Another thing is the fact that Bill Powers developed these levels through quite intensive introspection, including method of levels itself, to decide upon how he would parse out the levels of perception. And it's deliberately there such that on the whole, the simpler and more short-term inputs are organized lower down the hierarchy, such that any kind of self-fundamental long-term goal can be achieved through this cascading delegation of controlled inputs that go down the levels, such that there's no direct link between anything you've got at a high level and any behavior. Okay, the way you manage and organize your life is to delegate what inputs you want at the level below, which in turn delegate what inputs you want at the level below that. This whole system is automatic and unconscious. It doesn't require conscious awareness. So the idea is that once we've constructed this hierarchy during infant development, we operate it in an automatic way. Now, obviously consciousness comes in, and we come back to that later, but the idea is this process is totally automatic, and these signals we don't need to be conscious of. Yeah, the examples that Fred Nichols described there just try to illustrate how we can parse out any kind of everyday activity or goal into these components. So starting at the top, I want to have a healthy diet. How am I going to do that? I'm going to avoid caffeine in the evening. How am I going to do that? I'm going to follow a recipe. How am I going to follow a recipe? Well, I'm going to follow these stages of get cup, brew coffee, fill cup, sit at table, drink coffee. That's my kind of sequence. How am I going to do that? I'm going to get hold of these categories of experiences: coffee, cream, sugar. how am I going to organize them? I'm going to organize their relationships, their ratio that they are to one another. And how am I going to ingest the coffee? I'm going to take a sip of it. How am I going to do that? I'm going to lift the coffee up to my lips. In what kind of arrangement? Through sitting at a breakfast table. And what sensation am I wanting to experience? The taste, the temperature, and how am I going to do that? Through adjusting the muscle tensions throughout my body to keep that cup of coffee moving. Now, obviously, it's really hard to do justice to something that is in parallel, happening continuously and dynamically as it's happening. It's not a linear process. You've got to, even though I've had to, through the limitations of language, explain it to you in a linear way, we've got to understand this, according to the diagram, as happening at multiple levels in this branching hierarchy as it's emerging. And the idea is that's what behavior is.
Yeah. So it would be fair to say, Warren, then, that in fact a hierarchical diagram does not do complete justice to.
Oh no, in the slightest. This is more like a branching network of roots that are kind of fanning out. There's an impressive video that Ted Cloak did that's on YouTube that gets to the dynamism and more of the kind of range of it. But I've not seen anything that does full justice to what this probably is from a kind of a functional basis within our brains.
And of course, then there's, in that web, there's multiple things, multiple factors in a dynamic way, multiple different controlled variables interacting with each other, which leads us to conflict. Yeah. So can you say a little bit about conflict?
Exactly. Yeah. So what that entails, if you think of there being so many important inputs to our brains, to our experience, that we have desired states for, that we have preferences for, that we have priorities about. One of the most, if not the most fundamental property of the brain is it needs to be able to balance out the conflicts that happen in that system, where trying to achieve one perception gets in the way of trying to achieve another perception. You know, there are very simple ways that this is occurring within our muscles as they're in antagonistic pairs. But in a kind of everyday life, it's about decision making. You know, deciding to do one thing with your time is getting away with doing other things with your time, but also at real fundamental levels. For example, at a clinical level, it might be about striving to understand a trauma that you've been through so that you can resolve it, where you're going to have to think about the experiences, versus trying to push and suppress all those experiences out of your mind because you don't want to think about them, because you want to stay sane and you don't want to lose control. So there are so many ways in which we can be in conflict with ourselves. There needs a way that the brain has to sift through this and make sure that the whole process runs smoothly.
People experiencing, so there's a conception then of mental distress via this theory that has to do with inner conflict being about incommensurable values for different variables, incommensurate reference values. For instance, wanting one's opinion to be heard and wanting everyone to like I want everyone to understand, to hear my opinion, and I want everyone to like me. I want things to change at work, but I don't want to make the boss mad. And very simple examples. And that so to take us more towards the method of levels as a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that is grounded in PCT. So can you sort of take us in that direction?
Okay, let me be a bit more blunt about it. You know, method of levels was a way of introspecting through a conversation with another person that Bill developed with his colleague Kirk Sadley. He knew that it was going to be helpful therapeutically for people, but it didn't become a therapy until the 90s when Tim Carey worked with Bill on it. And it's still just a way of talking to help that form of introspection and resolution of conflict. And whether we call it cognitive behavior therapy, counseling, co-counseling. We've even called it discovery talk recently. Doesn't really matter, you know, that's in the business of ownership, really, of something. What it is in essence is a direct way that PCT can inform a conversation with two people, such that the person talking and describing a problem is in a better position to resolve the problem the more they have this kind of conversation, because the person that they're talking to is listening intensively and attentively, and regularly asking questions because of their innate curiosity about what that person is describing. And that listener is doing their utmost to be fully independent, providing no forms of advice, interpretations, summary, guidance, formulation of any kind, but devoting themselves in that moment to try and scaffold the clients, the person with the problems, scaffold their conscious awareness, so that person keeps it on the control systems that are in conflict and the superordinate system that's driving those conflicting ones. Okay, so if someone is talking to me, for example, about whether they should be facing their fear and confronting something that they're terrified of, I want to know the two sides of that. What's driving them to want to face it? How's their life going to be different if they can overcome this fear? What difference will it make in their relationships, and what will it look like when they try and overcome it? But equally, I want to know why they're so afraid, what they think is going to happen, and what do they notice in their bodies and their minds, and what comes to them when they do that. The idea of doing that is you're keeping their awareness on these two goals, these two control systems that are fighting it out. And the idea is that the longer you keep that in awareness, that is an indication that learning is happening and change is going to happen in the control system that's keep putting those two in conflict. That process is called reorganization. Now, the fascinating, well, maybe a bit of a historical note is about reorganization, is that Bill Powers did openly and has regularly pointed to how there's an analog, or how the idea of a process like this came from Ross Ashby's work. The idea that you need to add variety and you need to create a trial and error change in order to regain control. The difference, or the key thing about reorganization in PCT is it's a kind of it's an orthogonal system that comes into play, and it's superimposed on this automatic hierarchy. So I just want to show this because it might make it a bit clearer. So can people see this diagram? On the right is the control systems that we've been describing. The idea is that that's how we manage all of our lives, through these systems, and they're very well automated by the time we're adults. And Bill proposed that there's a separate biological system, the reorganization system, that is used for both constructing this perceptual hierarchy during infant development, but also maintaining it and pruning it and adjusting it constantly. And the idea is that it focuses on a certain locus, a certain focus within this hierarchy, and it keeps it there. And while it's there, it tries out different parameters on the hierarchy. Okay, it might adjust some gains, it might adjust some amplifications, it might kind of twiddle around with some connections or with some weightings or with the way that some of these functions are created. Okay, and it's doing it in a random way, and it will keep on doing that as long as these systems are in conflict and there's error. And then when that error reduces, it'll stop fiddling. Okay, and it'll allow that system to carry on in its smooth way. So it's fascinating because any effective therapy that you encounter has an element of exposure, perceptual exposure, people sitting with and disclosing difficult emotions, people exposing themselves to feared situations, etc. And according to PCT, the reason that works is it because it allows that person willingly to sit at that zone of conflict, explore and perceive these kind of multi-level experiences, and keep it there long enough that reorganization, this trial and error process, actually stumbles upon a change and a reprioritization that regains control. And Method of Levels is about making that process happen in the right place for a person to resolve the conflict that they're stuck with.
Thanks, Warren. One of the many things that I've personally found appealing about the Method of Levels, both receiving it, so to speak, as the client, and learning to use it as a facilitator, is the autonomy that it does continue to maintain for the person with who's brought the issue forward. In that, as you said, there is no hypothesizing by the therapist. There is no framework of pre-prescribed psychological schema that this complex or that complex. So there's no hypothesizing. There is simply listening attentively and trying to through questions help that person do their own reorganization, lead to their own reorganization. And can you say that can you talk about the idea of what the therapist is looking for in the conversation? There's to keep them on track, and then there's looking for disruption. So can you say a little bit about disruptions?
So Method of Levels is deliberately simple, and it's deliberately perceptual, in the sense that as a therapist, you've only got two goals, two things to worry about. You want to ask more about the problem, so what the person has come to talk about. That's your one goal. That's your kind of foundational goal, if you like. And then you have one other thing to do, which is to notice disruptions. Now, disruptions are what, as a therapist, you might perceive that you see outwardly that the client is doing. It might be that they're using a certain word, that they pause, that they smile, that they shift their eyes. It could be literally anything. And you have no idea what that signifies, okay? So what do? You ask. So you say, well, what happened when you just smiled just then? Well, when you pause, what was going through your mind? Or, oof, you said that word loudly. What's going on there? So you just draw their attention to the inward perception that was going on around about the same time as you noticed something on the outside, and you just ask about it. And the idea is that you're helping them to notice fleeting perceptual experiences that they wouldn't have otherwise put into words and seen as part of this discovery, this description, this understanding and exploration of the problem. And often you encounter a memory or an image that they might not put into words. Sometimes you notice a conflict. Sometimes you notice a higher level goal popping into the head. This sounds ridiculous. Why? Because I'm not this kind of person. Whoa, you've gone right up to telling me what kind of person you are. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you iteratively follow those rules as a therapist, which is very liberating. It frees your mind from all kinds of arbitrary rules that psychotherapists seem to give each other and have given each other for the last 100 years around how you should do techniques. In Method Levels, you're just yourself following those goals.
And I love this image of the spotlight of consciousness, that, and the idea that the reference value for each level is, in a sense, set by the level above it, right? The source of the conflict is further up in the hierarchy. So, and, there's the classic things that are, the fodder of everything down to situation comedies where a couple is fighting about where someone puts their toothbrush. And in fact, the conflict is not about the toothbrush. It's about a sense of respect or a sense of whose home this really is, right? So, and that those disruptions are indicative of, in some fleeting way, the flashlight sort of going up for a second up to the level above where that's been setting the reference value, but then we bring it back down, and that in spotting the disruption, in a sense, the therapist is just encouraging the person to keep that flashlight up in the attic just a little longer.
To tell them where to put it. Our job isn't to
but to ask about it, it'll keep it there maybe a little longer. Yeah.
The logic behind that is, if you're helping them navigate their own way to it, they'll be a lot better doing it by themselves than if you give them all kinds of magic tricks like hypnosis and what do you want on your gravestone and kind of metaphorical leaps to try and get them there because you think you're a clever person as a therapist. Being a method levels therapist is about being absolutely thick and curious. It's a Columbo attempt. You know nothing. You know absolutely nothing about what's going on for that person, and you're just about got enough kind of intelligence to piece together the description of what they're giving you, and then everything else you just want to know about. So you're so excited about finding out more.
So is this a good time for us to do a demo?
Let's do it.
Okay. So I'm going to be the client. I bringing in a real life situation that I'm wrestling with. What's that?
We're going to go a low risk scenario, and you're going to be the client. Is that right?
I guess it's relatively low risk. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's serious though. I mean, I can only work with something that feels real for me. Otherwise, I'm trying to make it up, and it won't work well.
I think making it easy.
Acting.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll do this for, I don't know, 10 or so minutes, maybe talk a bit about it and then move into questions, yeah?
Okay, I'm going to go on to speaker view so I can look at you a bit better.
Okay, and I think that for folks watching, speaker view might be advantageous, but obviously it's up to you.
Yeah, just mainly because you're so dashing.
Yeah.
Okay. You're going to start then?
Yeah.
Okay, so what would you like to talk about, Tom?
I would like to talk about sort of internal struggle I'm feeling at work. There's been obviously in society a great deal of upheaval lately and around social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusivity, which I'm really a strong believer in and want to be part of positive change. And it just so happens that I was the acting head of my department shortly after the murder of George Floyd in the United States, and upsurge of the Black Lives Matter movement and other connected movements. And so it fell to me as the department head to be taking the lead in a lot of these struggles and a lot of these works. And we have a very active student alumni group called Fine Arts for BIPOC. Those who aren't familiar with that term, BIPOC's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I've engaged in a lot of work. And it's incredibly difficult, fraught work that's, made me a lot of different types of enemies, in places, in quarters that I did not expect. There's the people I expected to resist. And then the thing that I found most hurtful is the friendly fire. And I'm struggling to not use my privilege to walk away from staying engaged.
Tell me more about that, how you're using your privilege to deal with a friendly fire.
Well, I'm saying if I were to walk away, if I were to say, well, I've had enough. I've tried my best. I've had enough. I'm tired that even the people I'm trying to help are getting angry at me. That's actually a privilege, being a white person, because I can walk away from a conversation on race and be just fine. Mm-hmm. Someone with a different color of skin.
And are you thinking about walking away?
Not really.
What's going on there?
Well, because I think because I know I can't, because I know I won't. I guess I just want the constant. I guess I want the endless rumination to stop. Okay. I want the sleepless nights to end.
About what?
The rumination about the different voices of criticism that I'm receiving, and how I feel like I go to bed at night and I'm debating 10 people in my head. Right. When I'm trying to go to sleep.
How do you want to go to sleep?
I just want to be at peace with how I've done the best I could that day, and tomorrow I'll get up and do the best I can again.
Does that ever happen?
What's that?
Does that ever happen?
Yeah, occasionally.
Right. And how bad does it get when you've got the the critical voices.
It's pretty uncomfortable. It's pretty uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. And is that the worst thing about this issue?
No, there's fear too. There's fear.
And which do you want to talk about? Well,
I'm feeling like I should be talking about the fear because it's more fear making.
Mm.
I feel like the fear is actually the big bugaboo in the room here.
Right, go on then.
Well, these things become explosive. They become explosive in the world of social media, where things end up online and spread quickly. And
how hard do they explode?
Well, that's interesting. I think at times it feels like the world is exploding, but the number of people that actually visit the Facebook page of my particular department is probably under 100 people.
What did you notice there when you answered that?
I noticed that when I was actually thought about the size of the explosion relative to explosions worldwide, it's probably more of a firecracker than it is a thermonuclear device. Yeah.
You, Tom?
What's that?
Is that a problem for you, having a firecracker explosion?
I guess if it's a firecracker, it's sort of your ears ring for a bit, and then you carry on.
And is that what you're afraid of, or is it something else?
Ooh. I think I'm afraid. Wow, it's very hard to find the words for it. I'm afraid of the whole situation spinning out of control.
Okay. What does that look like?
That I cannot make myself understood to anyone.
Gosh, why are you smiling as you're saying that? What's going on?
Well, it sounds sort of so Kafkaesque that I don't know why that's making me smile, but it sounds. Well, it sounds a bit hyperbolic to say I could not make myself understood to anyone. I might be able to make myself understood to one person, and maybe that's enough, you know? Because when you ask me when are there times that it feels okay, and it's usually after I've had a conversation with one person who I think gets it, and then I'm actually able to be chill for a while. Just one. It only takes that one person.
Huh. How's it going talking about this?
It's helpful. It's helpful. I'm feeling that sense of relief when I think about it. There's just there's one person who I think understands me, I'm not lost.
Does it have to be the same person, or can it be different people? Can they take it in turns?
I guess it can be different people, and I think in retrospect, it is more people than I'm realizing. There's one person in particular that I talk to that I come out of those conversations and I go, okay. I'm not completely at sea, but I think there's more.
What are you noticing there is your.
Well, I glanced at the chat for a second. That was all that was.
You said there's more, and then kind of.
Well, there's more people. Does
that make a difference?
It's making me actually feel more vulnerable in this moment for some reason. And I think part of it is because I saw what was in the chat, which was an interesting question.
Well, we sometimes like questions coming in randomly, don't we?
Yeah.
What's the vulnerability about?
How badly I need other people to understand what I'm thinking. How badly I need to overcome the limits of language or work within the limits of language to forge a connection where someone else might say, wow, that sounds hard. I can understand. Because one of my biggest fears is that I'm trying to work as an ally on the side of my BIPOC colleagues and students and alumni. And there are all kinds of reasons to the reasons to become a reactionary are just right there. They're so easy.
Mm-hmm.
They're so easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's so easy. The first time someone I think I'm trying to help says, no, you're not helping. It's so easy to just go, well, I tried then.
Right. So
Right.
it's so easy so many times. What's going on?
I just don't want to take the easy way out because I don't think it's right.
Okay. And are you worried about taking the easy way out?
I guess I guess maybe a little. I don't think I will, though. I guess I just think there's just some kind of strain and stress around the easy way out just sitting in front of me constantly.
Huh. Okay. Okay. And are there any other ways out besides the easy way out?
I guess there's creating different boundaries for myself, structuring the way I engage with the situation.
And how does that seem to you?
Well, it gives me a sense of control, doesn't it? It gives me a sense that I can parcel out, you know, this is
fit with the easy way out.
Well, it means it's thoughtful. I take some sense of control. I'm not completely at the mercy of other people, but I'm also not walking away and surrendering and shutting myself up in my home and not stepping into a thing that is something that I believe is my responsibility.
And are there any problems with those ways out?
They're still bound to be misunderstood,
Mm-hmm.
but it feels less daunting somehow.
Any other problems with them?
It's labor intensive. I'd rather be able to just shoot from the hip and have it all go fine rather than have to like.
How does that sound to you, saying that?
Well, it just it makes me, I think, realize how much I long for a world where people can just shoot from the hip, but with respect and with generosity.
Huh. And can you imagine
shoot from the hip and still be generous with each other?
Can you imagine doing that yourself?
I think that's what I try to do.
And is that different from the easy way out?
Yeah.
What's going on there as you work that out?
Well, I think maybe I am shooting from the hip,
right,
and trying to, with a spirit of generosity that I don't think is necessarily always reciprocated. But, but maybe that's not the way. Maybe I need to be more circumspect, and maybe I owe it to myself to be more circumspect, because if it's hurting me this much, maybe I owe it to myself to find another way to stay engaged that is more circumspect in some way.
Should we round up there, Tom?
Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, there's lots of comments and what have you. I don't know, maybe Angus might be in a better position to extract them because we were quite immersed in that.
So I think before we dive into all of those comments, what might be useful is if you could just recap, because it's been a very intense process.
It wasn't intense.
I don't mean just that, the whole thing. So we introduced PCT and you did an experiment, and there was a kind of key fundamental insight that it brought, rubber bands, right? So what was that? And then you demonstrated that there's this structural model that Bill developed that explains this, which reconciled the behaviorist and the cognitive and the other things that were otherwise not integrated. So what essentially was that, number one? And then two, you went on to MOL as the sort of development of that with this hierarchical structure and reorganizing. And you then did a demonstration of working with it. And I think what might be really interesting is to say, could you just say something about what were you doing? How was MOL at work in what you were doing? Can you give a kind of reflective view on what you were doing? And maybe Tom can respond to that, and then we'll open it up to the questions.
What I was doing was very mundane, but what I was doing was I was following those goals because that's what PCT, the conclusions of a PCT understanding of psychological distress is that when you're in a conversation, this is what the listener should do. but I wasn't thinking about PCT while I was being a method levels therapist. I was just thinking, what's the problem and what's that disruption? That's all I was doing. I had no kind of, I wasn't trying to think about theory. I wasn't trying to think about Tom's life. I was just very self-consciously knowing that I'm on the outside of his brain, and all I can do is nudge it in a direction that this theory suggests should be helpful for him. But I wasn't thinking about theory while I was doing it.
So what's the problem? Did that look like keeping the knot over the dot? I mean, metaphorically, is that equivalent? Is that something like keeping the knot over the dot?
According to PCT, behavior is the control of perception. So anytime we're doing anything, we're keeping a knot over a dot.
Exactly. Right. Beautiful. So there've been lots of comments, and I think it's interesting to maybe good idea to differentiate between comments and what are the key questions. Down in the bottom right, there's a reactions button. If you have a question that you think would be helpful to everyone else and not just to yourself, could you click on the reactions button and click on the yes, which is a green tick button, please?
What are we doing? Sorry.
If you have a question to ask,
Okay,
Bill, to Tom or to Warren,
you
then you can click on the reaction button, and there's a little green circle with a tick, and then we'll see who wants to ask a question. Bottom right, when you might have to move your cursor because it might be hidden, it might self-reveal itself when you go down there.
Angus,
Yep.
I don't find it, but I would like to ask questions and to comment.
What I'd like is a question that would help everybody else.
And a comment that will help everybody else.
Let's take some questions first, Boris.
Can I make a comment first?
You seem to be insisting, so you're keeping your knot over that dot, so you better go ahead.
Okay. I am very glad that that Mansell presented PCT in a way that I would call it introduction to PCT, because there are some places where many things can be added. I would like if Mansell could show again the last diagram, the big diagram, if that is possible.
Okay, yeah, I can sort that out. Where's my...
Yes, now we see the diagram which should represent the PCT function of organism from genetic source to 11th level of hierarchy. You see it. This is the original diagram, which has no connection to essential variables or intrinsic variables, as powers call it. I'll have maybe some troubles with language. Please excuse me. I had to add here that output function. You see it here, and input function from genetic source was changed. This is original diagram from Power's book, Behavior, the Control of Perception. And I added here some arrows that connect output function of genetic source.
You need to say where here is, because we're not seeing what you're doing.
Yes, you don't see it because Doug Purcell published it as
no, what I'm saying is, if you just explain rather than saying here, say what you mean.
That, these arrows, which were added later, help understand how organisms from genetic source to hierarchy function, as that was the prior thought of Ashby. These diagrams show quite the same essence as the Ashby's diagram, Ashby's diagram of immediate effects. It shows, as I said before, from processes from genetic source to heresy, to top level of the heresy. And here we see one problem. Now, you see at the top level of the heresy, you see a question mark. Do you see it?
Yes, top of the hierarchy, but on the right.
This question mark is problematic because it's not showing the close system of the organism. And to remove that question marks, we need to improve the whole diagram. But here, Ashby and Powers did different. They make difference in their theories, and that theories can be somehow equalized if we add here few elements or more elements and those arrows, so that the organism will start to function as homeostatic whole. The problem is that Powers did change his mind sometimes, and that is the problem also that Warren used the title of the book, Behavior. That's not is the control of perception, but behavior and the control of perception. Now,
I don't think Warren ever said that was the title of the book. I used that phrase to say that is.
Yes, but you are not the only one who is using that phrase. Some of members.
But I don't think Warren ever claimed that was the title of the book.
Yes, take a back and you see he didn't claim that, but he said that behavior is control of perception. That is simply not true, you know.
That's what the title is.
And it will be hard to prove that behavior is control, because in PCT is mantra that behavior is not control. So that is the first problem that will be somehow seen from this new diagram. If it's made, I'm inviting you to my presentation in President Series, where I will show the complete diagram with physiological, biological, genetical, and neurophysiological, and so on facts, which are not included now in this diagram.
Great.
Okay, so Morris, it's really helpful that you say that there is some other discussion on this, and there's dialogue going on about different versions of this model and so on, and it's still an evolving science. I think it's really exciting that science continues to evolve and that people work on it. But I am concerned to make sure that because there are a lot of people who are trying to get into some basics, that probably that's a conversation that would be more useful in one of our subsequent colloquiums that go in more depth into some of these subjects planning to bring out, and I'll say more about that later. There was a question that was asked earlier on by Marius, if I've got your pronunciation right. Does the concept of different levels direct us to the possibility of owned, in brackets, of owned gradual autonomy of these levels and the components that enter them? Marius, you might want to just ask that question again. And just to note, David, I note you've got a question to ask as well. I'll come back to you, David Dewhurst. Does the concept of different levels direct us to the possibility of owned gradual autonomy of these levels and the components that enter them? I'm not sure what he necessarily means by that, which is why he might want to say something. But I'm, for example, interested in the fact that each individual cell in the body, because it's a living organism, is also following PCT principles so as part of that hierarchical cascade. Warren, Tom.
No, I don't quite get the question. I mean, if is this to do with imagination mode, that you can have recurrent connections go between levels?
Is Marius still here? Let's see. Yeah. Marius, I'm probably not pronouncing your name right. Marius Zabinski. Explain your question if you're there, sir. Otherwise, we'll move on. I think we better move on. David, you have a question to ask.
Got 4, but I'll see how far I get.
Right.
First, I'm interested in what kind of range of the area of what we call psychology, Warren, you see PCT covering. I can see at the lower levels there's analogies between just notions of focus and constancy and how we control perception. You also said behavior occurs inside the organism, I think, which is that really behavior or is that constancy? At the upper levels, I can see certain people are determined to continue seeing the world in, say, terms of either maybe class conflict or market efficiency or something like that. I mean, what percentage of the papers published in the British Journal of Psychology or whatever, do you, if you sort of permeated your perspective, would you expect to see using a PCT framework a lot?
I'm afraid people are going to know my answer to this question, and it's quite a cringeworthy one, and the answer's all of them.
Yeah, okay.
It's an organising principle of life, so it's going to apply wherever there are living things that control. So
there's nothing.
I apologise for that, but
it
doesn't mean that all the details are filled in, but it does mean that the kind of, as I say, the organising principles are specified by this theory.
And so when you get to the top level, we're not really exploring, we're just trying to stabilise ourselves, or you just...
It's control all the way down. You're controlling perceptual experiences. Obviously, those ones at the high level are going to be constructed from much more rich kind of layers below. So they are very sophisticated perceptions that we control at high levels when we're kind of trying to be an honest person or being kind or being helpful. But according to this theory, that we still need to be able to perceive that sense from an interaction and to be able to control it and be as helpful as we want to be as considerate as we want to be as combative as we want to be. You know, they are potentially, even the higher level perceptions are ones that you can control. And obviously actors are very used to having to construct these kinds of perceptions that other people may hold within them.
And the reorganization process is critical to that because, you know, I could be trying to control for my perception of being a good parent. That might shift from saying, I'm a good parent if my child gets good marks at school. If my child's not getting A's, I must be doing a bad job as a parent. That can shift to a completely different conception of being a good parent. So at one level, my perception of myself as a good parent hasn't changed, but the reference values below that for what would indicate to me that I have fulfilled, that I'm making the match between the desired perception and it can change.
Yeah.
One of the things that really excited me when I came across this is it made so much sense of really ordinary phenomena at work, like all of the managers and people all over the world who keep talking about resistance to change. It's in the literature everywhere in business. And resistance to change just means that, you know, that people are busy on the other end of the rubber band and somebody comes along and gives it a tug and tells them they have to go over here. And so what do? They counteract it because they're trying to stay in their norm, stay in their situation.
Reorganization itself is a trial and error process. You need to have that opening for spontaneous, unplanned changes, and that in itself can be frightening to people, to think that they're going to allow some inner system to tinker around with their thoughts and their plans and their motives. And people can guard against that and be very rigid in their goals and not subject themselves to end the conversation about what their priorities are.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Malcolm in a moment, but let me just ask, why can't this be creative, and why can't people being, as it were, recursively or reflexively responsible for creatively modifying their own way of seeing things? Why does it have to be random?
I mean, there's quite a long history of the connection between randomness and creativity in Darwin, for starts. So I don't know. I don't understand the question. There's typical. I mean, as far as I know, it, some of the most successful theories of creativity are ones that invoke random trial and error variation, and you know that's.
I've been troubled by the same question, Angus.
So, yeah. Okay. So,
yeah.
It's to do, you know, but I don't want to take more time. Malcolm. Okay, would you have a question?
Yeah, actually, Angus, maybe your question sort of framed mine. I'd like to ask Tom how he uses this in theatre, and suppose specifically what for me is resonant is like in the performance of a role, the playing of a role.
Well, as I sorry, Malcolm, I can't remember if you were at the session that I had. So to me, this maps so completely onto the Stanislavski system of acting. It's as if Stanislavski and Bill Powers were on the phone together, because that is entirely, and it's entirely now permeated the way I teach acting as another, and it's actually deepened it because in Stanislavski, we often talk about the objective, and then there's the obstacle. What's the thing that's getting in the way? But now that I can talk to acting students about saying, well, it's not that there's one objective and that when there's one obstacle, you're actually trying to control multiple things at the same time. And as the scene progresses, you know, and I think about McCulloch was referring to someone else, but McCulloch used to talk about the redundancy of potential command, where that whatever you can be controlling for all kinds of things, but whatever is the most pertinent, whatever the environment gives you the most pertinent information about at the moment, that one will hop into the driver's seat. So if I'm go to a party hoping to meet a potential romantic partner, but I'm also hungry, you know, the buffet might get my attention, but then someone walking across the room might get my attention, and the buffet becomes less important. So it's deeply intrinsic to the way that I've been training actors. We use it very specifically around conflict, because as you know, I was talking about conflict theater, and also talking about to Angus in terms of, you know, resistance to change. Not knowing about the not over the dot is so critical, because if I'm in workplace conflict and if I give a description of the behavior, literally pulling in the opposite direction of on the rubber band, I think that's what can lead managers or coworkers to say, that's just a difficult person. That is just a person who wants to be difficult. Because when I look at their behavior, every time I go this way, they go that way. They're just difficult. They're just oppositional. It's about trying to lower the waterline so we can find out, actually, that person's got a knot and a dot. They're trying to control that. Something about this change that I'm trying to make is disturbing. Maybe I ought to try and understand what their knot and dot might be, rather than just categorizing them as an oppositional personality. I hope that addresses some of the question, Malcolm. Yeah.
Michael O'Connell asks an interesting question. He finds it intriguing, but he's interested, why is there so little reference to emotion and emotions in the description of PCT?
Well, the funny thing is that PCT, because it's been around for a long time, Bill's had a lot of chance to write more on it since the basic explanation of the model, and so have lots of other academics and practitioners. So yes, there is a literature on what emotion is from a PCT perspective. I wrote actually an entry in, it's the Encyclopedia of Sports Psychology, and I've got a chapter in there describing what emotion is from a PCT perspective. Bill Powers wrote a short piece. There's a chapter on emotion in the 1972 book, And then he wrote a follow-up to that, which is on a website called Living Control.
So obviously, having written a whole chapter on it, you could reduce it down to 2 minutes?
In some ways, Bill's model of emotion doesn't differ vastly from some other psychological theories, in that he recognizes the action readiness of the physiological aspects of emotion. So at the same time as one's preparing oneself in terms of your muscles to kind of experience or achieve your desired experience, you need to, through your internal systems, your hormones, your heart rate, your physiological systems, prepare yourself for whatever goal it is that you set yourself. And arguably, if there's no conflict, then you will just get that physiological system ready. It will allow you to control the experience you want. You'll get it, and you'll walk off. You know, someone who's kind of very, you know, a circus performer who can literally kind of go on a trapeze and not experience the same level of fright, because they know in a non-conflicted way exactly how they're going to kind of land safely, if you like. So emotion comes when there's conflict, or at least our conscious awareness of emotion comes when there's conflict. And in that regard, emotion is a good signal for what to talk about in therapy, because if there's emotional systems still floating around, there's a bit of arousal, there's a bit of heart fluttering, there's these unmet goals where you're feeling the error of something that you wanted and you didn't get, that's the arena of emotion. And probably the fact that we're constantly aware of emotion is because it then attracts our awareness, and then if we're working on this well, we sustain awareness on what's emotional. We write stories about it, we share experiences with others, and we reorganize and we resolve the conflict. So emotion is our conscious awareness of our body's emotional reactions is a very good signal for effective reorganization. But
this is where the arts and sciences have to work together. Sorry, Warren.
Yeah, go on.
This is where the arts and sciences, I think, have to work together because and I would say that it's also connected to the role that emotions play in homeostatic processes, right? As the signal that says you better attend to this, the way that pain does, right?
Yeah, the more that you're in conflict, the more your intrinsic systems are going to start to experience error, and then that tracks.
Jared, you've unmuted. Is that because you want to ask a question?
Oh no, sorry, no, I'm cooking. Don't unmute me. If I've done that, I've done it.
Okay. Anyone else want to ask a question?
I have a question, Angus.
Go ahead, Thijs.
Yes, I've put a question there on the chat. If we can see this, use the 11 levels on social systems. So when you have a community that is in conflict, a lot of fear because a new company is going to install in the region, and you can also see that social system having all these feelings and thoughts. And can we use the 11 levels, or the whole PCT, to support this group to to think about what's happening and to assume behavior that is good for them and not destructive or anything like that?
Well,
thank you.
For most of that, I defer you to an incredible sociologist called Kent McClelland, who uses PCT and has done in his work for decades, and he's written a very detailed chapter in the interdisciplinary handbook of PCT that came out, that I put together last year. But Kent's the authority on the sociological perspective on PCT. But in a simple sense, it's what's called collective control. Bill's levels are they're functional systems inside one person's head. Okay, and that always will be the case. They are not models of some social system. Okay, but of course, the person who experiences that social system has a perception of what that social system is and how it in itself is something they want or they don't want in their lives, as it were. And so, yes, to that degree, we can do that. There's also a really elegant dissertation by a academic called Franklin Lenk, and it's called How to Instigate Minority-Led Change Within Institutions. And it's actually about using method of levels to help empower minorities within organizations to lead their own change processes by being more aware of what they want and being able to resolve their internal conflicts to achieve that. So yes, it lends itself in a kind of, I think, a really elegant way to square the circle between the individual and the group. Does PCT, but Kent is the first step for that.
James Bryant, you got a quick.
Sorry, Warren, can you put down his name for me? Kent's name, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Angus,
Ken McClelland. So James Bryant, you had a quick question?
Yeah, thanks, Angus. Hi, Warren. I'm still stuck right back at the beginning. When you were doing the, we'll call it the knot experiment, and obviously you're quite interested to know exactly how everybody interpreted it. How important was it that people understood the instruction you'd given, and have you consequently tested giving different instructions that might generate the same result as a control, for instance, mirroring, matching, etc.?
Yeah, no, we've not tried giving different instructions rather. We did try giving the observers different instructions. So we did a condition where we actually asked people to look at the rubber band throughout. I think that was it, to look at the knot, I think, throughout the video, and still most of them didn't kind of get the idea that the person on the left was controlling the knot over the dot.
Might be worth saying that Warren did this where he was the experimenter, he knows all about it, so he was holding one end of it. I have done this, and I've seen it done on a number of occasions in which both participants had no idea what was going on. They only knew their own instruction. So one of them was told, keep the knot over the dot, and privately, and the other was privately told, gently disrupt the other person. Your job is to mess them about slowly, right? And those were the two instructions. And then everybody was asked, well, what is each of them trying to do? And
can I ask the question,
when they get to the insight, I mean, for many of them, it can be shocking to actually kind of realize, oh, actually, this person's actions look like the opposite of the other person's actions. Why? Simply because they're just trying to maintain what they want to maintain, and the other person's getting in their way. Yes. Who was that?
Can I ask the question?
Yes, but I don't know who it was who was asking. So go ahead and ask it.
Warren, can you ask me? Can you answer me? What is PCT about? This is a overall question. Maybe for the last, what is PCT about? In short, one sentence. What do you think?
You sound like you're laying a trap, Boris.
I'm not trapping you. You know what Bill Parr said about PCT, or he wrote about PCT. So you know what he wrote? I wrote it, okay, 100 times, but you could repeat it.
What's your answer, Boris? What's the answer to your own question?
That question, I can't.
What is PCT about? Now, most members thought that PCT is about behavior or control of behavior, or I don't know what. But I was talking to Bill probably more than 100 hours, and it was clear that he is talking about PCT as general theory of organisms functioning, because the basis for his theory is Ashby's theory of design for a brain. And we know that Ashby probably was the first one who included in theories about behavior, organisms functioning. Brains can't work without organisms. That is clear. I hope. So PCT is the general theory, and that means also the generally behavior is not controlled. Generally, behavior is, by Herbie's words, homostatic, if you understand what I want to say. And when the organism works as a closed system, then behavior gets a totally new meaning, you know. If we understand that, then we understand behavior, because behavior is the result of what is happening in organism. It's not vice versa, what is happening to what behavior is doing to outside world, and it comes as a perception into inside world, that is driving the organ. It's not.
Boris, I find that very helpful. I'm going to have to draw us all to an end because it is now our official ending time for this session, although I'll say a bit about that. But what, keeping the knot over the dot, that's a homeostat, right? And so there's a lot of this homeostat, negative feedback, and so on, which dovetails beautifully with cybernetics. And as you probably witnessed, there's an evolving dialogue, discussion, and so on about this, as I think there is in cybernetics between various versions of first, second, third order, and all sorts of different versions of it. We're in a beautiful evolving paradigm, which I find a creative opportunity. And on that front, we have 2 more sessions next month. They're already up, and several others beyond that. We've got confirmation that Humberto Maturana is going to do a session for us, so keep in touch. I'm very pleased to welcome some new people to this session, and I'm pleased to see some new people who've joined the Society. Thank you very much. Please stay in touch. Warren and Tom have said that they will hang around, I think, a little bit longer. So if you need to get away, it's 7:30. Session is officially over. Thank you very much for coming. And if we stay around a little bit, it will open up a little more into a general colloquium with a smaller group that stay behind for a little while.
I'm just checking it.
So if you want to ask a question, just unmute and in a nice civilized way, come in and ask your question. Or you want to make a comment, ditto.
So if you don't mind, it's James again. Warren, have you looked at the fact that, or have you looked, it's not a fact, let's try again. Have you looked at the situation where people with psychiatric disorders have actually found an equilibrium? So they are in balance because they've done something mentally to correct a disturbance. And what we're trying to do is to put them back to an alignment with what society sees as a non-disturbing behavior.
No, I mean, we've done a lot of interview studies with people who've recovered by their own reports from mental health problem. And we try and keep those interviews as open-ended as possible, driven by the participant as possible. And we listen to what they tell us about the process, and we kind of code the themes in what they've told us. And what you hear a lot of is loss of control. So the idea that they lost control over some fundamental aspect of their life, but sometimes they've got their word for it, like a rock bottom or some kind of pits that they got into at the worst. So they experience mental health problem as a loss of control. I guess that's part of what we notice. Yeah. Another thing we notice is that they notice recovery as regaining control over their lives. And in some interviews, people have been quite specific about talking about being the director of their own life, that they needed other people to recover, but other people provided the support so that they could direct their own recovery. And so a lot of people who have this lasting recovery talk to us about the autonomous self-driven aspect of their recovery. And then they also talk often about their new self and their old self. So they feel like they've changed as a person since recovering from the mental health problem, but they've not forgotten who they were when they had their most severe difficulties. But it's almost as though they can see their old self through the eyes of their new self, almost as though their new self is at a higher perceptual level, because it's arguably taking into account more of the conflicting goals and values and self-standards that they'd had up until that point, they were stuck in the mesh of the conflict over. We don't hear so many people talking explicitly about conflict, and I think that's part of the slippery nature of conflict, which is partly society created. I don't think society encourages us to believe that we are a conflicted combination of kind of control systems. You know, we all want people to be a unitary, consistent, reliable, trustworthy personality, you know, but actually that, you know, what PCT argues, and arguably Baby Freud argues, is that we're not. We're just a conflicted bunch of goals and wants and needs. And some of us manage our way of organizing and linking those priorities in a seamless way that gives us a good sense of being a solid, reliable self that can continue into the future. Lots of us aren't so lucky. You know, we're a completely different person in one situation to another.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.
I don't remember whether the example was Bill or someone else, but I think the example was given of somebody on the one hand wanting to be a good person at work, and so staying at work and being dutiful and successful and so on, because that would really help the family. And on the other hand, wanting to get home and be with the child before they went to sleep and be part of and responsible for the home. So that there's kind of situations, contextual situations of the world that create difficulty of reconciling which of the various versions of outcome that you want to have you're going to follow. Is that?
Yeah, and I think PCT would always put the zone of causality within the individual and their goals, but obviously as that person wants what they want and others want what they want, they can work out whether they can configure a routine, such as, you know, your family routine when you're homeschooling and you're both working as parents, in a way that meets both of your goals and minimizes the conflict. So yes, environments can either make conflict less or more of an issue, but we need to be resolving those through the agency of the people who are structuring those environments.
So can I ask everybody who is not Warren and not Tom, who I think has had to leave, what do you think was going on in the conversation between Tom and Warren? What did you observe going on, and how do you relate to it? Some brief comments, please. You'll have to unmute to say something. Then we'll get some feedback from Warren on whether he thinks that, you know, we're on the button or not. Ava, you look ready to say something.
Ava would be a great person to.
Yeah, but I'm an informed observer. But one interesting thing I noticed in that conversation is you had Tom talking and switching like different perceptions, and Warren following where he was going with his questions and pointing out different things. And then in the chat, there was another conversation going on, which sort of was in another direction, like everyone needs love, for example, was one reaction, which was a different kind of response to what was happening. And I think, well, that's interesting to explore what's different in MOL from such kinds of responses.
That's great, Eva. I mean, it's everyday life, and it's most other psychological theories. They want to come down to be concrete about what's the problem and what's the solution? The problem is negative thinking. The solution is kind of challenging. The problem is self-criticism. The solution is compassion. The problem is unconscious conflict. The solution is free association, or whatever, you know. And you know, according to PCT, you can't pin the problem on a particular theme, a particular want, or a particular need, or a particular concept. All you can do is notice that conflict undermines control, and when people's control is undermined, they get distressed. And so in PCT, that's all you care about. It's like, well, where's the distress? Where's the conflict? How are we going to help you resolve that? I don't care what it's about. You know, the client cares deeply, but my job is to just help the client be in charge of what that content is. No psychological theorist, no passerby, you know, no folk psychologist is going to tell either of us where the problem is. That's going to be up to the client to tell me through the kind of persistent way that I'm kind of nudging them to come to their own personal decision or perspective as to what the problem is.
Can I chip in with my observations? So at the beginning, I guess you were kind of warming up, but your questions, Warren, were a little bit kind of Eliza-like. And I guess I'm worried that I'd fall into the trap of, you know, saying, tell more about your mother kind of expressions. But no, later on, as we got into it, I could see you were looking for, I guess, lower level cues, and kind of given the discussion later about emotion, you were looking maybe for arousal, kind of hand gestures, those kinds of things. So were you looking up for low level things, or were you actually engaging at a high level?
Yes.
On Tom's side, I think he was being actually quite genuine. I think he was actually exposing himself. I don't think playing a role, although given that he's in theatre, maybe he's really good at acting.
He's an open guy. But no, it's not so much low and high. What I can only comment on is what I hear and notice and perceive. But actually, the assumption is, or the proposal is, those surface level things that I've perceived from the outside are co-occurring with an internal perception that's often quite high level, you know. So you smile because you think, I'm not this kind of person, you know. So yeah, a smile is concrete, but that's not the point. The point is, I'm on the outside, he's on the inside, okay? And my job is to try and keep him on at the perception he's at, the level he's at, but noticing kind of where it might go to a higher level, but not because I'm trying to mind read him or trying to assume what he's thinking. I'm just noticing stuff on the surface and saying, was there anything there? But I don't do that all the time. A load of it is just it's deliberately. Doesn't matter if it's a lie, like if you're genuinely curious in what's bothering someone else, I bet you could do 80% of this work without doing method levels. If you keep that mindset, whilst someone you care about is telling you about what they're stuck with, you could do 80% of the work without learning method levels.
So, sorry, Steve, go on.
Yeah, and one of the other question, it wasn't quite clear to me what the role of disturbance plays in methods, whether you seek to deliberately introduce disturbance, or does the kind of the person you're observing kind of disturb themselves when things get uncomfortable.
Yeah, so when conflict is happening, two systems are creating dynamic and escalating disturbances for each other. That's why it's such a tough situation. It's not like the loop we saw at the start, where a disturbance is just some kind of random pseudo sine wave. You know, when you're in conflict, when one system disturbs another, the other system deliberately tries to regain control, and in doing so disturbs the other one again, and it's kind of this kind of real escalating thing. As a therapist, I'm not trying to be a disturbance. I'm trying to be a feedback function, but I might be a disturbance intermittently, and you just have to live with that. You're trying to be a feedback function. You're trying to be an echo of what that person has just done or said. So they get an extra chance to perceive it, notice it, and do something with it. So they might hear what they've said themselves, but most of us don't, we just talk. So just asking about it makes them go, oh yeah, I didn't mean quite that. Or sometimes we notice an image we have that we're planning a route somewhere, and we notice while I'm working my way around my memory of it. A method levels question about that would be, well, where are you going around this route and what's around the corner? So you're just supplementing the feedback function that they have through your questions to make it richer and to kind of improve its depth and detail.
Gordon Collins, I know that with some of your background in interventions and social work and language, and which also has background in cybernetics, be interested in your comment, your observations.
Sure, Angus. First of all, Warren, yeah, I really appreciated what you did. I thought you represented your two dimensions of very well in there, both identifying disturbances as well as just helping to capture what was there and just asking questions or being curious. But being curious already brings an emotional tone to things. Being curious is both what we say, but it's how we say it. So my question would be, how would you characterize the relationship you're having with the individual? And I'm sure my experience is it's quite different with each individual. So this was pretty straightforward. You had someone that was forthcoming, but could you just comment on that aspect? Because I always think that there is an emotional context of which we are operating.
Yeah, there's no doubt an emotional context, but I guess the point of method levels is not to be trying to control that. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to create a certain kind of relationship or a certain kind of emotional context. And one way we train method levels therapy is we have a client talking about a problem, and we might have 5 therapists, and we change therapists every 5 minutes. And you know, sometimes some people have a preference for the same therapist. A lot of the time you do that, people don't feel it's a problem. Other people think it's better to kind of have these different questions coming from different angles with different emotional tones. And so I guess our view is that there's an elegance and an essence to the relating process as you're asking the question, but the relationship is something that we're not trying to foster going forward or in the long term. We're just being there right now and being an enabler of that person resolving that problem. And other than that, we're being ourselves, which is obviously going to have an emotional element to it.
Yes. Good, thank you. I actually think that is, you are actually, I think, starting to articulate a relationship, which is being an enabler, which is, you see what I'm saying? In a way, and I realize it's not, you're not trying to bring anything to, specifically. That's the power, is this leaving them with themselves. But anyway, there's more on that, but I think it's an interesting area for exploration.
That's a term that could quite well describe the relating process in method levels.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Vincent.
I wanted to ask Warren a question about, so if you say you're an enabler and you're mainly seeing yourself as a feedback function, then basically the main thing you're, I guess, do is you work with language. So you ask questions or you reflect something. So you make assertions, etc., and observations. So in what way do you pay then attention to your own language? So I'm familiar, I guess you're familiar with clean language or systemic modeling, where there's a very strong focus on being as clean as possible, or making very conscious choices about where you lead or don't lead. And yeah, I'm wondering what your
I mean, I think it ends at the same point, which is we want to enable to make things as simple as possible and to enable the client's control. I'm actually involved in a separate piece of work called Empowered Conversation, where we use PCT to train carers in how to talk to people with dementia. And it's about how to have conversations that keep the person with dementia in control of the conversation. And that's through using terms that are as straightforward and simple and perceptual as possible, and use the client's frames of reference and don't depend on you know, knowledge, assumptions, shared views, etc. And that's quite similar, that kind of rubric, is to how we work with method levels. We generally use the client's own language. We don't try and summarize or reinterpret, and we hone in on what the client last said and say, well, what's that about? What do you mean by that? What did you notice when you told me that? So yeah, it's pretty clean, not because that's our goal, but it ends up being pretty clean because we're trying to help the client kind of, in a no-nonsense way, get to the bottom of the problem without any flowery language getting in the way.
Yeah, I guess that's also not the purpose of clean. Yeah, that it was just a way of doing it, so you create as little kind of disturbance as possible, and you keep basically it focused on the client. I'm just wondering now if you're familiar with James Lawley, and because I introduced PCT to him, and he said, and method levels, and he said, hey, I'm really interested. I'm going to look at it, but I think it might be interesting to maybe connect you because I'm well familiar with him. And I think it might be really interesting to bring these different types of therapy together and see what happens when you talk to each other.
That'd be great. I mean, if you're on Twitter at all, then we could start something going on there.
Okay, I will have a look. Thank you. Check.
Marius, you were invited to ask a question earlier on. You were very busy on chat. You obviously had a lot of comments. I'm just wondering whether, if you're still there, you want to add something. It's possible, but you've been chatting, so you'd have to unmute though. Maybe you don't know how to unmute, or maybe you're not there, or maybe you have no question.
Marius?
So,
well, should probably wind up soon. I've got to.
Yes, we should. Warren, I'm going to ask you a totally wild question, and then we'll end. All right. So, Bill's theory is a theory of the living, the behavior of the living, all living. So he's not differentiating. So I think bacteria and humans and everything in between. So if theory of levels is relevant to humans, but with 11 levels, say, then it must also be, in some sense, true all the way through, although the bacterium's level may be only 3 or 1 or something like that. Now, if human beings can learn, we have neoteny and things like that, which are reflected in these higher things and the ability to learn and adapt. What we find with lower organizations is that they have less ability to adapt, but we're going through ecological crises. Is there any way that this can be turned into ecological design? Obviously, we can use it to understand what's going on ourselves and maybe design things, but is it at all possible to imagine a future in which we help organisms of the world learn to adapt?
Crikey. Well, I mean, I think pretty much you could pitch the same question to mental health problems, with this idea that some kind of design is going to come in and help them see the way or get insights, or kind of, if only they knew this therapeutic kind of approach. So I would, in the ecological sense, would tackle their challenges in the same way as I tackle therapy, in that I'd want to help foster opportunities and niches where other animals that were faced with conflicts could engage in effective reorganization. And it may be that there's certain environmental circumstances that are making that reorganization process not able to sustain itself and not able to lead to an effective solution, or there's a lack of a feedback process so that the organism can't get the results of its actions efficiently enough. Now it sounds very abstract, but I guess if we talk to a biologist, we might be able to find their circumstances where maybe humans are reducing the abilities for organisms to engage in their own reorganization. But I mean, that's so close to evolution anyway.
Yeah.
We'd have to work out where evolution finished and PCT actually added to this in explanatory power.
Sure. People are working on questions like, can we get microbes to process plastics, for example, things like that.
Can I add something? Can I add
Was
something?
that Boris? Yeah, please, Boris.
Yes, I think, Angus, that you were asking about genetic control systems, because the bacteria is a genetic control system. It's a pure DNA, which maybe some other molecules. But that will be, I will try to present that how genetic control system controls. But it's connected to organism and of course to hierarchy. And evolutionary, if you look, bacteria.
You mean hierarchy, not heresy, right? Did I hear you right?
Hierarchy. Hierarchy. Or it's going from genetic, PCT is trying to, as Ashby is trying to formulate or make a form of organism that is working from genetic control systems to the highest control systems. And we know that evolutionary first, the DNA or genetic control systems. And then the building of the hierarchy and other were in 4.5 billion years, they down or up. But it was a long time to build from genetic control system the whole hierarchy. And that was the question which me and Bill many times go through, because reorganization is somehow not the concept which could fall in genetic control system. That was also the idea of Ashby. He didn't mention anything like reorganization, he went directly from genetic source to essential variables, and then from essential variables to S, that is nervous system. And somehow Bill didn't get this way. Here are differences between Ashby and Powers about how evolutionary and how organism functions with genetic control system. But I will try to highlight this in my another session or presentation, so that it will be the whole, so that you will see how genetic control system affect essential variables and essential variables affect the whole organism and so on. It's a quite complex thing, so PCT is not very easy to understand. I think that Warren showed that it's not easy.
Right.
Warren, sorry, I didn't want to make it any trap anymore.
No, it's really good.
You're a nice
guys.
talker,
Everybody,
Warren,
it
I
is.
Say, you're a nice guy.
Warren,
thank
can
you.
I take
what?
Sorry, I'm just calling it an account. I'm just calling it to an end because it's now is now 8 o'clock. Thank you, Boris. And I think it's this relationship between Bill's and Ashby's and other things, no doubt, will play out in future sessions. Warren, there was a really engaging, lots of chat remarks about how engaging and interesting and fascinating it was, and we're always taking big, complex subjects and trying to compress them into a short session and do something. You did a lovely job of introducing that. I have about 50 questions to ask just at the first level, and those would lead to some more. I hope that other people will find it interesting. Can you name the key books where should they go in order to find out more?
Yeah, so the key book is Behaviour, the Control Perception, the 1972 book, which was also, there we go, another copy, reprinted in 2005.
But that's out of print.
It's out of print, yeah. And I've been trying, it's 50-year anniversary next year.
I think we should get together and try and work out maybe with some of the others like ASC and so on and get out a new edition of it.
That'd be amazing. There's also an unpublished...
that'd be great. Available at all good second-hand stores.
Yeah, ridiculous prices.
Bill's got an unpublished manuscript, a small book, which could be tied in with a reprint, so it would be amazing.
But isn't there a nice introduction as well for those who don't want to go into the detail just to get them started?
So Bill's nice introduction is a book called Making Sense of Behaviour, the control theory view.
Also out of print, yeah.
Out of print. In terms of very kind of, you know, a broad introduction is the website that I manage, which is called pctweb.org. Some of the links are a bit out of date on there, but all the text is there, and it's got an introduction in itself to PCT.
Great.
And then there's, in terms of all the latest research and dialogue, is the Twitter site IAPCT, where I kind of update people and everything. And then there is a PCT, is it IAPCT.org, isn't it, Eva? The website, which is Association of PCT. But there are loads of papers out there. Most of my papers focus on the mental health aspect.
If you search on living control systems, you'll also find quite a lot of literature on that. So everybody, thanks very much for coming. Warren, big thanks to you. And look forward to seeing you next month and in the months that follow. And please write to me. You can, you know, if you're secretary@cybsoc.org gets to me. If you have ideas for sessions, for activities, for things we should do, I'm inclined to think that it would be good to have some sessions that are more introductory, some more advanced ones where we can get more into detail, and there are different topics and areas to look at. So enjoy the ride, and in the meantime, stay safe and enjoy life. Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks again, Angus. Cheers, Eva and Richard, for the moral support, and you, Steve. Cheers, then. Bye.